Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Digital Innovation Summit. This is actually session 2. We had our first session earlier today at 9 a.m. And that was a debate, and that was a very passionate debate on the downside of digital transformation. Now, at this session, we're going to basically talk about the journey to digital banking. We are honored to have David Cass to be our guest speaker today. David is a veteran in the information technology field. He has been the Chief Information Security Officer at IBM Cloud, and he was the Senior Vice President and Chief Information Security Officer at Elsevier, and then same thing at Freddie Mac and JP Morgan, a number of financial institutions. He is currently the Vice President of IT and Cyber Risk at the Federal Reserve Bank in New York, the supervision group. So we're going to spend this morning and this session listening to David and for his expert advice. David, take it over.
Bruce, thanks for having me. And again, it was a great session this morning with the panelists. So we're going to talk about the journey to digital banking today. But before I jump in there, I need to say I am a banking regulator. So any opinion that I express today is mine and does not represent that of the Federal Reserve, Bank of New York, or the Federal Reserve System. So thanks again for having me today. So this morning's topic is going to be the journey to digital banking. So I figured we would start out with what is digital banking and kind of discuss some of the nomenclature from that point of view. Is when you think about, okay, online banking has been around for a while. So that's almost really, the first generation from that aspect of it. But when you think about digital banking, now we're really talking about what is really at the heart of transformation. So now you're talking about how do you take all the processes that go on in a financial institution from end to end and make that a digital workflow. So that's one of the aspects of it. And then, we have some new entrants in the digital category too. We'll touch on, what is DeFi from a decentralized finance point of view, as well as you have some new asset categories of the, digital assets and where are they in this whole digital banking and the journey to get there. So, first of all, why this is really, I guess, a pertinent topic is there's been step changes in technology that are really at the heart of driving this change. So when you start thinking about what are those technologies, so you take a look at, you have cloud, you have AI, you have ML, and you have blockchain. And these really represent a significant step change in technology, from that perspective. And they can have dramatic effects on business performance, as well as they can have untoward effects, like in our panel discussion earlier, that if you don't plan for them appropriately. Because these new technologies really get at the heart of changing the way businesses operate. So it can no longer be just purely an IT type of discussion. So we're going to talk about, what are some of the changes that organizations face as they embark on this digital transformation for banking? What are some of the security challenges that are faced? What needs to change from a governance, business, and a technical alignment point of view, as well as, we'll touch on risk management and, accountability, since a lot of this is done through use of third-party service providers. So, why is digital transformation, for financial services complicated? So I guess the first thing is we'll kind of have a little bit of discussion around, what constitutes a legacy bank, what constitutes a fintech. So when you take a look at most of your brick and mortar financial institutions, they've been around for quite a while from that aspect of it. And, as part of being around for that long time, you go through acquisition, you go through opening new lines of service, but you also grow through, as you acquire other banks or other types of operations, you're really looking at from the perspective of now you have a very complicated legacy portfolio. So it's no longer very easy to address of let me quickly change and adopt new technologies. It needs to be a much more thoughtful process. And now you also have new categories of entrance of fintechs, where you have organizations that are looking to take on various aspects of what's been traditionally financial services. It could be payments, it could be insurance, it could be things with distributed ledger technology. And the question of, in some cases, fintechs fall under regulation, in some cases they don't. So part of it is looking at how do you kind of address some of those challenges. And then some of the other aspects that we'll talk about are what's new lately. So in addition to cloud, AI, ML, blockchain, we've also seen whole new asset categories. So, you start thinking about what's a digital asset from that point of view. Cryptocurrency, NFTs, what's going on in that space. And then as you potentially have a new asset category, what does that mean from a financial services perspective? So when you think of traditional assets, you have maybe your house, your car, other things like that, other investments, where there's a link to an actual piece of paper or an actual physical good. So now with digital assets, if it's an NFT or if it's a cryptocurrency, what happens if that's destroyed? Is it really gone forever? From that aspect of it, and how do organizations that are in financial services need to think through how they deal with some of those topics? Another part of it is looking at, as you're embarking on adoption of transformative technologies, is you really need to start with the strategy and plan, but part of that plan needs to look at how has my ability to be resilient changed as I adopt more and more technology. And organizations think of business continuity and disaster recovery in a typical sense. They usually think of it from the construct of the email system's down, this database system is down, or this one service is down. How long is it going to take me to restore that? And we've seen, we're in an era where attacks are more destructive. Ransomware is prevalent. And that really takes the approach of you're locked out of all of your systems. So when you revisit your use of technology, you have to look at your recoverability and your resiliency from a point of view that what happens if there's a major corruption to my online system or my connected backup system? How and can I recover from that point of view? And how does it change the way I need to think about that? From that point of view. And also, with the adoption of those technologies, as we touched on, if you're able to join us, this morning, from the aspect of are you choosing an appropriate timeline? Digital transformation isn't something that occurs overnight, and it's not usually something that occurs in a year timeframe. Having helped organizations through this in my prior professions, it's usually you need a 3 to 5 year time horizon from that aspect of it. So you need to make sure that you have the right level of plan from that aspect. And then you need to start thinking about, the other complication is, where do I start on this journey? From the point of view of organizations go to cloud, they go to AI, ML, they go at different phases. And if you have a complex technology portfolio where you're not a startup, you need to think of, well, where does it make sense for me to adopt? So maybe, in an area, if you're going cloud native, you want to start availing yourself of, how do I use containers? How do I use microservices? How do I truly adopt an agile method? And start thinking about, as you plan, what are the applications or services that are best suited towards that type of adoption from that aspect of it, where you're developing in the true cloud native capability. Other aspects is, you look at the complex technology portfolio, then you need to start thinking about, well, there are aspects of maybe a migration makes sense. And migrations usually fall if you have some of your more modern language applications, or you have on-prem applications. So maybe those are candidates for easily rehosting from that point of view. But still, at the end of the day, when you're looking to avail yourself of the bigger benefits of the new technology, a lot of times you have to really look at that adoption or a refactoring method where you're going to get rid of your older monolithic apps to avail yourselves of the new services. And in some cases, you may be a mainframe shop. You may want to avail yourself of AI and ML. So now you have to start thinking about, well, how do I safely expose those new services, from my mainframe apps to the new services and new business applications without creating undue risk? Am I leveraging APIs? Am I leveraging code that we're developing from that aspect of it? So those are just some of the things to start thinking about. And then when we start thinking about, well, why are these really, significant changes in technology from that aspect of it? Part of it has to do with, these technologies really change the fabric of the business. When you look at traditional IT operations, things would work if they were siloed. But now when you look at, cloud, you look at AI, ML, you look at blockchain, you look at other technologies, these really need to be very tightly integrated with the fabric of the business. So now all of a sudden you have to start thinking about, how do you get your technology professionals closer to the business? And not only that, how do you make sure your technology professionals really understand the business aspect of it from that point of view? because it's one thing to seat developers next to the line of business, but those developers now still need to understand the business that they're supporting. It's no longer bringing up just broad generic categories of technology for a service. It's now really, if you're adopting cloud, you're looking at it because maybe you want to get closer to your customer for certain types of processes. So you really need to understand how the organization works from a business perspective, not just from a technology perspective. And that also kind of goes to how do you continue to upskill today's workforce, not just from a technology point of view, but from a business point of view, to really make sure you can migrate or adopt these technologies safely. And part of it also that we touched on in some of the earlier panel discussions is the business also needs to understand what the impact to the business is going to be from a change in the way of business processes. Governance may change. How quickly things get promoted to production will definitely change. So part of that is working through that whole picture, which kind of demonstrates that today more than ever, you really need, when we talk about strategy, that strategy needs to have a close linkage to the business strategy. So no longer can you say, I have a security strategy or I have an IT strategy that isn't closely linked to the business strategy. These things need to have tight integration points, as well as having the right people at the table for that discussion. So, part of that is, now we'll talk about a little bit of, how does digital transformation impact business and security strategy? Earlier, we talked about the point of view that, once businesses are operating in a certain manner, they get used to it, not necessarily from a complacency point of view, but complacency is a factor. So you have to start thinking about, now that I'm putting developers next to the line of business, how is that changing how we go to market? How is it changing their understanding of the business? And now also, where is the risk moving, from that perspective? Now, by pushing things closer to the lines of business, you still need to make sure that there's a proper level of risk oversight. So in other words, as you get more distributed with your organization and more integrated, you still need to be aware of, who's accepting the risk, how are things getting raised through the organization, and from a senior management point of view, how are you dashboarding these things to potentially know, are you taking on too much risk, or are you taking on too many different challenges in certain areas? So this way, should the need arrive, you can course correct. And then, we touched on the fact of, governance in general. So while we're kind of, I guess, discussing nomenclature earlier, when I start thinking about, what is business governance, I really think about it from the process of, okay, it's the accountability framework and provides a means in which, how is oversight done to ensure that risks are adequately mitigated and measured and controlled from that point of view. So it's about, how do you get that enterprise level visibility in that aspect? And then, a lot of times with what goes wrong with governance, we talked about the fact that on an earlier panel is that as things change, organizations need to continuously reassess and reevaluate, not just reevaluate their information security program, but also reevaluate maybe their risk and audit programs as well from that point of view. Because this way, the worst case scenario is, all too often you have strategy thought about as, okay, it's a document that was created, often not revisited, and usually only gets dusted off when audit or a regulator comes for it. So you need to make sure that these strategies are updated on a regular basis, and that there's linkages between your security strategy, your IT strategy, and your overall business strategy. So this way you get better visibility into, how does the organization need to change to support these things. And it's the same thing also when you talk about security strategy with the adoption of new technologies. You see, ransomware, other attacks are very, very prevalent. So organizations that have established security programs need to be able to revisit them as you're adopting step changes in technology. Revisit them from the perspective of, well, what does this mean to my security organization? Do I still have, whether I'm adopting cloud, AI, or ML, do I still have the right level of visibility? Do I still have the right level of monitoring that's needed? What's my level of accountability or responsibility from that point of view? Because when you look at things like outsourcing, institutions can outsource almost anything that they want nowadays, but you can never outsource accountability for that decision. If you're a regulated entity, accountability ultimately lies with you at the end of the day. So part of it is, making sure you have a very fulsome approach to how you look at these technologies and how they're getting adopted and integrated into the business from that aspect of it. Now, because we touched on, some of the organizational roles and responsibilities. So we need to make sure that, as you're adopting, digital transformation, one, having the right strategy from a planning horizon is very important. So again, thinking about technology, not just in the, are they doing an annual budget, but if you have these large transformational projects, you should be looking at doing a 3 to 5 year strategy with the understanding things are going to change, but to realize any significant transformation at scale, you need to have that, about 3 year planning horizon from that aspect of it, with the understanding that you may revisit budgets or things like that. But if you're only planning from a 1 year out, it's going to be very hard for an organization to realize any significant, transformation. Because part of you going through the transformation is not only looking at how do you get, better ROI, but how do you get better optimization for the business? And a lot of times, as you're bringing on these new technologies, you're still going to be potentially operating some of the older technologies before sunsetting. So there's a longer horizon before you start to realize the full benefits. And sometimes organizations get a little bit too short-sighted in that and forget that you need significant runway to really adopt it. And then, as you're talking about these new, technologies, how do you revisit the security controls? If you're a regulated organization, even if you outsource in a more traditional format, you're usually used to saying, okay, here's my maybe NIST 853 Rev 5 list of controls that we're adhering to, from that point of view. And if you're outsourcing it to a provider, maybe you hand them that book and say, these are the controls that I expect to be enforced. Now, when you look at cloud, AI, ML, blockchain, you're talking about, commoditization of technologies. So there's certain ways that you consume it, but it's not like you can completely customize it. So you need to take a look at your control environment and say, okay, of the controls that I am currently operating, how are those, what list of those controls are available to me in this new technology? Where's the gap? And then to address that gap, are there supplemental tools or services that I should be consuming to close that gap? Or maybe, a decision is made depending upon how you tier your data. If it's high risk data or highly regulated data, you might decide, okay, that delta for now is too big. So you're going to move, I guess, less regulated or less restrictive data to the newer technology. So part of that is having that constant oversight from that aspect of it as well. And then really looking at, the importance of application security within this. It's, in some cases, it's a matter of what's old is new again. Right? When you look at, organizations oftentimes consume code from the outside world. So you could be having utilization, a lot of open source code. So how do you know that that code is safe? From that point of view, are you doing the appropriate level of scanning? Where's your code repository? From that point of view, because we've seen now plenty of episodes where, some major tools that have had privileged access to large companies' infrastructure, their code base was compromised. So part of it is whether you're using a third party or whether you're developing your own, there's some key lessons learned in that. And part of that is getting back to, some of the fundamentals of application security. You're looking at, okay, how are you signing your code? How are you developing your code? So this way nobody can hopefully put, major alterations in that code without it being approved. So do you have the ability to detect those changes? And also if you're using open source, how do you ensure the integrity of that open source code to make sure that, somebody isn't pulling a library from open source that's already has malicious code in it? Because a lot of times, developers don't necessarily develop from scratch. They reuse what's out there, or there may make sense to use a code library that's out there. So but part of that needs to kind of fall under the umbrella of risks and security concerns that you're looking at. And then also with the adoption of these new technologies, looking at, okay, what's it mean from a privacy and compliance point of view? So you may not be a highly regulated financial institution. Maybe you're in healthcare where there's healthcare regulations, or maybe you're a regular corporation, but you still have to be aware that, currently there's more than 80 countries that have privacy laws on the book, and some of those have data sovereignty laws. So you have to keep in mind when you start thinking about data sovereignty and things like the cloud, that usually means, okay, I have to restrict my data maybe to a certain geography. So part of that needs to be planned for ahead of time before you go in there and find out that you've accidentally replicated sensitive data all over the world. So you need to look at it from the point of view of what controls do you have in place to ring fence any data that has data sovereignty requirements? And then from a data residency point of view, as part of your resilience plan, how do you make sure that, where is that data residing? And do you know when that data is moving? So this way you have some control and optimization around that. So, other things that come up, from that point of view with the adoption of new technologies of, again, we kind of touched on what's old is new again, is the insider threat concept. If you're in business and you have employees, you have insiders. So now the question is, how do you take into account with the adoption of new technology, what's changing? So as you adopt the new technology, from a cloud perspective, maybe you have to look at, okay, what are you responsible for as the company, and how do you manage your insiders that have privileged access? And do you have the same level of monitoring capability? And then whoever you're using for your cloud service provider or your third-party service provider, how do they manage their insiders from that aspect of it? Do they make sure that they can only use privileged accounts for certain types of activities? So part of it now is, re-looking at who you're doing business with, because now the attack vector has always been really, going for the weakest link. So you could be very strong, but if you're outsourcing to a company that isn't, then how, you're going to be breached essentially. So really having a good understanding of what the responsibilities are, and also making sure that there's, policies and procedures in place and ways of dealing with it when unexpected events come up. Because when you look at, okay, COVID-19, I think initially everybody thought, we'll be out of the office for maybe 3 weeks. So needless to say, a year and a half later, people are still outside of the office. So now you need to, once everybody got shifted home, you need to rethink about, well, do I have the right level of security, monitoring, patching capability for all of these individuals that are at home? How can I leverage some of the new technologies? In many cases, we saw organizations starting to adopt broader use of cloud, because now all of a sudden, where you might have had 50 corporate campuses, now all of a sudden you have 5,000, because you have people remotely working everywhere, and that changes your ability to patch and manage those assets. It doesn't change your responsibility to patch and manage those assets. So those are some of the things to start thinking about from that aspect of it, of really looking at how do you address it from that point of view. So being able to plan for these types of events, unforeseen or otherwise, and being able to shift the workforce home, a lot of organizations did very well with that. Then the key question is looking at, now that organizations have been operating in that for a year plus, have they gone back to address those risks that were earlier accepted? So in other words, when everybody was rushing to get individuals home, maybe they had to seek laptops and procure them outside of their normal corporate environment. So now, okay, are those devices patched to your corporate standards? Are they connecting appropriately to your VPN, or are you managing them appropriately through VDI? All of this needs to be revisited. Or if you had highly regulated individuals where calls need to be recorded, things need to be scrutinized, do you still have that monitoring, in place? Because again, we expect shifts like this, but again, it doesn't relieve an organization of their regulatory requirements or their accountability. So those are some of the things you want to think about from that aspect of it. And then really in general, as organizations go forward, there's not just a huge security skills gap, but cloud gap, AI, ML. So part of it is looking at, how do we address these skills gaps with our existing teams? So as we're addressing and picking up new technologies, kind of touch on the good example that I've experienced as a CISO from the security aspects of it. As we were going to the cloud, I needed to reevaluate my information security team and look at the fact of, are they equipped to deal with the cloud? And in a lot of cases, it meant, re-education, training, because now all of a sudden somebody that used to be traditional infrastructure security, where they're actually used to supporting physical devices, going to the cloud means, those devices no longer, you no longer have the ability to lay hands on those devices from that aspect of it. So now all of a sudden, those individuals need to learn the code, like JSON, Python, other things become important. So part of that is looking across your workforce, not just from a security point of view, even from a developer point of view and from a business point of view, that as these new technologies are being adopted, where do I need to help upskill my workforce from that point of view? And that also kind of leads us to the, traditional, these technologies have forced us to revisit what would really be thought of traditional business continuity and disaster recovery doesn't really work in the same sense from a cyber resiliency point of view. Because now as these things are moving to all either cloud service providers or online providers, you need to start thinking about how resilient are you as an organization. So if you had a major disruptive incident, whether it's ransomware, whether it's something else like that, can you recover? From that point of view, we've seen organizations that can't recover. We've seen organizations that have paid ransoms that have partially recovered. So part of that really needs to be, revisiting that whole planning cycle, not just from a business point of view, but from a risk management point of view as well. And that kind of gets back to, with the adoption of these new technologies, not just revisiting, business governance and security governance, but really looking at how is this changing the risk profile of my organization. So, and probably one of the easiest examples is, we already touched on the fact that, okay, you can't outsource accountability. You can outsource operations, activities, and things like that, but you can't outsource the accountability for your corporation. So when you look at cloud, understanding how you consume it maybe as an organization, because you have infrastructure as a service, platforms as a service, and software as a service. And the important thing to understand is how that makes it different from outsourcing is usually in a traditional outsourcing model, you say, here's my policies, here's my controls, all of this needs to be in place. When you're consuming infrastructure as a service, you need to understand that, okay, you might be responsible for configuring everything, from a virtual hardware up point of view. And then maybe as you're consuming platform as a service, you're probably consuming it from, maybe the operating system level, or you may even be responsible for the hypervisor or things like that. So part of that is when you have that shared responsibility model, if you don't have a good accountability or a good RACI matrix, knowing of who's operating what, you're going to create a gap where bad things can happen potentially in that aspect of it. And the same thing, software as a service. Maybe you're consuming something large from that point of view. It could be something as easy as, maybe Office 365. Understanding, maybe you're only managing encryption, maybe you're only managing identity. But now you have to look at that as these new technologies are coming online, where everything has been used to running in one data center if you ran your own, or even if you outsourced your data centers. Now, the new data center essentially is virtual from that aspect of it, and you're running several of them. Odds are you're going to be in AWS, you're going to be in Azure, you're going to be in other, compute facilities. So you need to take a look at, okay, what's that change from a shared responsibility model? What's that change to my identity access management program? What does that change from resiliency? And you also need to start thinking about, concentration risk. Is it a concern? When you put, how much of your operations are you comfortable being outsourced to one organization or one individual? Do you need to spread it across multiple geographies? And we already touched on some of the limitations. In some cases, you may not be legally permitted to spread it among a geography. And then you just have to start thinking about, okay, what are my hybrid options, from that point of view of this transformation journey. Other things to start thinking about, and when we had a good brief discussion, and I know one of the panelists is going to cover it in more detail too, is, when you adopt the new technologies like, artificial intelligence and machine language, you have to start thinking about, if you're regulated, how does that change my model risk management program? Do I have the right level of governance? Do I have, transparency and explainability in those models? So if the only person in your organization, and you have thousands of people, if the only person that can explain it is your one data scientist, that could be problematic from that point of view. That doesn't really feel like it's a very transparent or well understood model. Other things you have to start thinking about too is, how do you test your models for bias? How do you test your models from a security point of view, that they can't be poisoned, they can't be stolen? So those are some of the other considerations, and it changes some of the way that you have to do security, from that point of view. Some of the other things too, with the basics of blockchain as a new technology. As organizations are moving to adopt it, it's important to start thinking about what problem is it really being used to solve, and that's where you have startups that are being able to adopt these things from net new, and then you have larger financial services organizations that maybe have legacy technology, where it takes them longer as a point of view of, you can't just rip and replace technology from that easily perspective when it's large and integrated. So you have to start thinking about, well, distributed ledger technology, what problem am I solving with it? Where does it make sense? Because again, in some cases, it's sound from its principles of cryptography, decentralization, and consensus from that point of view. So it kind of builds trust in transactions, but you have to look at, well, where is it fitting in the organization? How is it being governed? Is it a permissioned versus non-permissioned network from that point of view? So you know who the players are, and then you have to look at, okay, for unforeseen events, what's your stance on forking of the blockchain? What's your stance on, do you know how many nodes are out there, and is there somebody that controls more than 51% of the nodes? So those are some of the things to start thinking about, from that aspect of it. And then, as we start thinking about risk and compliance in general. So one, with the adoption of any of these new technologies, the first thing is to make sure you have a good understanding of what's your regulatory landscape. So in other words, if you're a financial institution, if you're a healthcare institution, again, financial institutions, you have lots of regulators, lots of regulations, based on what geographies you operate in and what services you provide. So part of it is looking at, what is the understanding of the regulatory landscape and concerns from that point of view. Is there any guidance that's available? And from our perspective, also, there's the FFIEC joint statement on cloud, which kind of really talks about, what are the principles of safety and soundness that are expected if you're a highly regulated institution operating in the cloud. So you should start thinking of it, from that perspective of, what guardrails need to be in place from a risk and compliance point of view. And then the other aspect of it is when we start thinking of, all of these technology skills where there's huge opportunities and huge skill shortages right now, when you start thinking about it from a regulated line where you have, your first line, your second line, and your third line, where, first line is traditionally your information security team. Second line is really your IT risk management team. Third line is probably your internal audit team. Part of that is looking at it from the perspective of not only do you need skills in the implementation teams that are your first line from that aspect of it, but how do you get the right skills for your IT risk management team? And how do you get the right skills for your audit team? Because part of having an effective second and third line is, do you have individuals that can effectively mount essentially the right level of challenge to the first line? You want them to be challenged on, okay, so how are you measuring your risk? How are you monitoring for these types of events? How are you controlling, how have your controls changed? So you want, organizations within your other lines, your second and your third line, to have the right skill set where they can effectively mount that level of challenge. And then the other thing, thinking about, when you look at the third party risk management and other elements of, how do you manage your cloud service providers? Lots of times management is through contractual obligations, but usually anytime anybody is calling for a contract review, something bad has happened. So you need to start thinking of it from more than just a contractual obligation point of view. We kind of talked about it. Okay, what are organizations doing to kind of share the responsibility, understanding of, what controls are they operating? What controls are you operating? How do you work together from everything that's testing perspective? From a financial institution, there's all kinds of requirements around how do you do your recovery testing. So looking at how do you integrate with that. So as you're taking on more of these third parties, you have to be looking at it from a risk and a compliance and a testing point of view of how do we integrate with them in a more effective level where you have visibility of if there is a security incident or if there is a compliance incident, to make sure things are getting addressed within an appropriate time manner. When you look at some of the regulations, some cases there's a 24-hour notification requirement, from that point of view to your regulators. So you really have to have all of these things built in as part of the strategy and governance. And it really requires an integrated team approach, that these decisions, shouldn't be made in a silo from that aspect of it. You're not looking at, do you have your risk team together? Do you have your compliance team, your business team, from that perspective? So really, as a wrap up, that, the right planning horizon is essential from that aspect of you're doing your digital transformation journey. Understanding, where you are in the adoption process. So in other words, don't boil the ocean. I mean, when you're doing digital transformation, you need the right time horizon, but you also want to make sure that you're picking the right projects. Does it make sense to avail yourself of this new technology from a transformation point of view? What problem are you trying to solve? Maybe you're trying to get closer to the customer, faster response times. So those are things to start looking at of, what is the reason for adopting this new technology and where does it make sense, especially if you have a large technology portfolio. Because in some cases, moving to the cloud will get you out of the problem of technology obsolescence that sometimes organizations struggle with. But that may mean that you have to refactor or go cloud native in that aspect of it. When organizations typically move to the cloud, a lot of times they do lift and shifts, which is not the optimal way to avail yourself of the new technologies, because then essentially you're taking an older technology, wrapping it in a newer technology and creating the need for two teams to manage it, as well as you won't get the bigger benefits out of if you want to do things like segmentation, things like getting used to more distributed technologies from that point of view. So really, having a good plan, looking at it from where are you focusing first? Are you focusing on adoption area first? Are you focusing on refactoring? Are you focusing on, migrations or maybe extending? And then having a good plan around that with the detailed milestones and the outcomes. And again, with the expectation that you're probably going to have a 3-year, time horizon from that aspect of it, of how do you get that fully done from that aspect of it? And it may be 3 to 5 years. And part of that is looking at your integrated teams. Do you have the right people at the table? What are the right training opportunities? And making sure that you have proper engagement from senior and executive management, so they understand where the new risks have changed, where things are getting adopted, and from that point of view, not just going to adopt these new technologies because everybody else is doing it. And we also touch on making sure you have the right level of challenge in your other teams, with your second and third line teams, so they can mount an effective challenge and make sure that the operational risk is, I guess, operating where it should be from that aspect of it. So really, for now, that's all I have for my part of this discussion and presentation. So I'm happy to open it up to questions.
Okay, we're going to open up open up the forum for Q&A, and our colleague Crystal will help us with that.
Hi, so David, so for the first question, we have, what would be a good practice with third parties like PayPal, Visa, or some blockchain services in the digital banking world?
So I guess it's looking at, so what services, so understanding fully, what services are you contracting with them to provide, because they provide different services within that space, and looking at how transparent are they about how they manage their risk? Because a lot of times what will happen is they'll have external facing security controls that are available to you as an organization, maybe for the integration, but you still need a pretty fulsome understanding of how do they handle their own security operations? How do they handle their own controls? Because how they're operating on the inside may be different than what's available to you on the outside. And you want to really have a good perspective on that, from that aspect of. So that's one of it. And then looking also what the contractual obligations too, because there's a lot of times as you're taking on these cloud-based services or other types of services, what we think of in the traditional service level agreements may be very different with these new services. The traditional SLA, from when we think of recovery time objectives or recovery point objectives, may be very, very different. So those also need to be revisited from that point of view, as well as the concept of what constitutes a force majeure or anything like that. When you have an untoward event like COVID or something like that, where all of a sudden everybody was scrambling, you don't want all of a sudden one of your prime vendors saying, okay, now all of a sudden, since I had to send everybody home, I'm not guaranteeing my controls are working. You don't want to be in a position where you're faced with something like that. You want to make sure that if there is an event, that they still have the capability of providing the right level of compliance for your organization.
Thank you. Our next question is, what place does cryptocurrency have in digital banking?
So that is a good one. And again, I'm speaking personally, from that point of view, and not on behalf of the Federal Reserve from that point of view. But part of it is looking at right now. Again, there's a lot of volatility in that space, and looking at it, is it an asset? From that point of view, is it a store of value? So, institutions are looking at that, because obviously you have big transactions being made within that point of view, and institutions want to be able to avail their customers of that service. But it also gets back to, okay, so now how does the risk change that if you're being crypto custodian? So now all of a sudden you're holding cryptocurrency instead of fiat currency. What exactly does that mean? And we kind of touched on it from the point of view that, okay, so in the event of a destructive event, what happens? Can you recover that? So part of it is trying to figure out what's it mean from an asset class? How is it being treated from that point of view? And again, we're looking at it. Lots of organizations are looking at, how do they start providing those types of services to their customers? Is it provided in a form of, investment fund? So there's lots of options that will be coming down the road later, but part of it is really understanding that it's still an emerging area. So, risk and volatility are a concern, and banks are looking at it. And, from a custodian point of view, if you are a custodian, you'll still have custodian responsibility. So part of it is looking at how does that change now that you're talking about something that's completely digital. So it's still a developing area, and I expect it to continue to be so for quite some time.
That's a great answer, David. So next question, for startup companies in the current environment, what are some best practices on technology integration? So
if you're a startup in a highly regulated industry, part of it is looking at, plan for the regulation, from that aspect of it. Lots of times I've seen very innovative stuff within fintechs and things like that. And the traditional startup model on I work with a lot of startups before is, hurry up and get to the revenue stage, from that point of view, where unfortunately compliance and regulation tends to be an afterthought. So now when you're thinking about things, within like decentralized finance, you want to start thinking about that ahead of time from the point of view of, it's much easier to address it as you build up on these new technologies. If you're building using DeFi, of how do you start taking these into consideration rather than get faced with the aftermath of trying to retrofit it, or looking at, who are their good partners in the area. Now, lots of times financial institutions are also faced with the same challenge of they may not be as nimble as some of these startups, so they may be partnering, where they're able to provide regulatory guidance to some of these startups in return for working together. So there's lots of opportunities for organizations to work together. And I think, there's lots of room for, faster payments, lots of improvements in the financial sector. But the key thing there is keeping that balance of the, if you're a net new startup, what regulations will you ultimately fall under? How will you start to address them? As well as, maybe partnering opportunities or other things like that, or other banks are looking at how do we start a true digital bank as a separate kind of entity.
Awesome. Okay, so the next question has like two parts to it. So it says, which organization regulates information security across financial and non-financial companies? And then they say, can you please name a few key regulations in place for information security?
Okay, so there is no one, I guess, from the US perspective, no one Uber regulator per se. So, a lot of times when you look at it, at least from the Fed perspective or things like that, it's, are you a state member bank? If you're a non-state chartered bank, maybe you fall under the FDIC or the OCC as the lead regulator, or certain financial institutions fall under us as the lead regulator. So there are, and then maybe you're a net new startup where maybe you want to do something in cryptocurrencies, or maybe, part of that is if you're doing business in New York, you need to get maybe what's called like a BIT license from the state of New York. And that means you fall under New York DFS, 500-17, which is pretty prescriptive around expectations for cybersecurity, where a lot of times, regulators may have guidance for broader expectations around safety and soundness. Sometimes other regulators are pretty prescriptive. So in case of like DFS 500-17, there's MFA requirements, there's a requirement to have a qualified CISO, there's a requirement to have things reviewed by the board and accepted. So part of it is looking at that, from that point of view. And also, breach notifications are tricky within the US that, right now, there is no national law on breach notification. Each state tends to have their own requirements around notification, and it may just be if it impacts citizens of that state. So part of that is thinking through, what data are you holding? What constitutes a breach from that perspective, and then working internally with your legal team or other consultants of that, what is your defined process for how you go about either notifying the AG if you have to in that case, or how you go about notifying that regulator. And those are the kind of things that you want to think about ahead of time, because you always want to start building those relationships and contacts ahead of time. The last thing you want to do is start running into law enforcement and everything else because you're in the middle of a breach, from that aspect. So it's always best to start, networking, building the relationships, and seeing what regulations are in your aspect of it. Same thing, like I think Wyoming introduced something around that, if you're doing something in crypto, that there's a specific license required. So sorry about the long answer, but there is no short answer for that. It really depends upon, are you in financial services? Are you not? There's other regulations for healthcare. So there's other regulations for insurance.
I think you answered it perfectly. So next question says, how do you think digital banking will affect the cannabis industry moving forward with digital currency?
So I think that's probably more along the lines of, are institutions allowed to accept the deposits, whether it's a digital deposit or whether it's a cash deposit, there still has to be, I guess, recognition in that space of allowing institutions to kind of accept and do business in that space, where right now, you see regulations on a state-by-state basis that makes it challenging from that aspect of it. And again, just my opinion.
Thank you. Could you name one innovation which would simplify web/internet security?
Ooh. So unfortunately, there's no one challenge to that, because again, when you look at how the internet was developed, it was developed insecure almost by design. It was developed from the redundancy perspectives and the resiliency perspectives. So really looking at it, I'd say organizations kind of need to continue to practice that defense in depth model of really looking at, where can you catch things happening? So it's kind of, you almost have that, a lot of organizations have that assumption of reach of where, okay, so if somebody's in, or we assume that we're compromised, where are the different layers that we can catch it? How do we how do we prevent stuff from coming in? If something does come in, how do we detect it? And then how do we respond to it? And then how do we ultimately, recover from it? So I think you need to really think in each of those categories, almost what's that? It's like the NIST CSF, the cybersecurity framework, where it kind of goes to identify, protect, and detect, respond, and recover. Because you really need to be thinking of it under each of those categories. Where do I have the ability to stop things? Because if you only have protection or visibility under one of those categories, that's probably not a good thing. You want to look at, having multiple opportunities to catch things. So if somebody does get through your initial layer of defense, how do you detect it? And then you can look at responding it. So maybe you can stop it from being exfiltrated. So you really have to look at it still as that multi-tiered approach. And that doesn't matter what technology you're looking at, you still have to kind of take that defense in depth approach.
Awesome. So this is an interesting question. Basically, this person works within like the prison system, and most of the prisoners either have felonies or they're not sufficiently creditworthy to obtain conventional bank accounts. And their question is, what are some conventional financial institutions doing to embrace this demographic and or the unbanked?
So, I mean, that's a great question. So I think there's a lot of work going on in that space of how do you address the unbanked, from that aspect of it. So you see that there's more entrants coming online from that aspect of it. And I think when you look at the concept of digital currency or things like that, I think that is going to also kind of increase the opportunity for unbanked individuals. But it is an area that still needs to be addressed. There are still a lot, not just from a prison perspective, but there are a lot of unbanked individuals, from that perspective, and it's looking at it. And I think that's why you also have categories like some of the, the big box stores or some of the other big name brands that are also starting to look at, what can they do in that space, from that aspect of it, where they're almost, coming up with competitor type banks or brands from that aspect of it. There's a lot of work still to be done in that space. But I'd say, the newer innovations that we're seeing, when you look at, DeFi, the whole concept of decentralized finance, I think that presents a tremendous opportunity to help increase the unbanked participating in the financial system.
Okay, as of right now, I have one final question, unless some other questions start pouring in. It says, how are purely digital banks like Revolt in the UK operating across Europe and Brazil that also use the Amazon cloud, and how does it comply with the country-specific regulations in a technology product?
Okay. So that is definitely something, that's doable. I'd say that the first part is, as you're coming up, whether you're an existing bank that's moving full digital, part of it is looking at, what controls do you currently require from that point of view. A lot of times the regulators aren't going to be as specific, saying that you must have X, Y, and Z. In a lot of cases, they'll look at it from a safety and soundness point of view. How are you protecting against these types of attacks? How are you protecting against these issues? So in that case, you'll look at it from the point of view that maybe you use NIST, maybe you use ISO. So you take that control set and start kind of doing the mapping that if I'm going to move to cloud, and prior to joining the Fed, as Bruce mentioned, I spent a lot of time helping organizations operate in the cloud. And I think the key to getting there safely is, look at what controls you need to have from a regulatory point of view, what you have from a security point of view, and then figuring out, each application is not necessarily treated the same. Even in your own data center, you don't have the same security level around every application, and start figuring out, okay, maybe this application for payments, it needs to just be PCI compliant. So maybe this can move, from to the cloud, and really taking it on that risk measured basis of saying, okay, here's what makes sense to start moving in right away. And then the other thing is, having transparency around the framework of understanding where your gaps are. Because again, there's an expectation that maybe there are gaps and maybe there's outside tooling or outside visibility that you can put to kind of close those gaps. So I'd say the first thing is, I would recommend probably having like a tiered data model. At least that's what I've done in my past life. I tiered the different data that I had. I had my highly regulated, highly risk data, all the way down to maybe things that I would consider like level 5, which was dev test, no live customer data, and had a spectrum across there of confidential, highly confidential, and figured out, well, based on my current organization, what controls do I have around each of those categories? And then I was able to easily do a map saying that, okay, this cloud supports easily applications 3 through 5. So I'm going to focus on starting to move there. Because the nice thing about what we see with the cloud service providers, I have overall about 7 years of experience in the cloud, that there's been huge step changes in the amount of visibility and additional controls that have been added. So the nice thing is every 6 months, there's additional control. So if you have that kind of matrix where you're looking at it, that maybe you could only add tier 3 through 5 to the cloud for now. 6 months later, additional controls are coming online that says maybe that satisfies the gap that you had for tier 2. So it's really, part of it is understanding that, having clear visibility into what risks are you taking as you move the organization to the cloud. Because again, accepting risk is a business perspective, but you want to make sure that you understand that risk and you have visibility into that risk. I think the panel earlier this morning kind of mentioned is that a lot of times, if risk acceptance is pushed too far down in an organization, you have lots of pockets where lots of risk is being accepted. And then if it doesn't have a way of bubbling up to the right metrics or right management, they have no idea that they've taken that much of an exposure. So part of it is looking at how do you measure it, how do you monitor it, and how are you transparent about how you're moving, from that point of view. Regulators and other, in my past, I've worked with other regulators even before becoming one, of kind of explaining, here's my journey to cloud. What challenges do you see? A lot of times they have innovation sandboxes and things like that. Regulators still, promote the use of innovative technology. You just want to promote it from a safety and soundness point of view, so nothing catastrophic happens.
Well, of course, David, some more questions have come in. Do you have time to answer?
Oh, sure. Yep. No, I'm good.
Okay, so we had one question that comes in that says, as debit and credit cards become easier to issue, what evolutions do you believe are necessary to maintain their current levels of payment security?
Okay, so I mean, that's a good question. So part of it is also kind of having that separate discussion around compliance and security, because you have things like standards. You have the payment card industry where you have a compliance standard. So part of it is looking at are you taking the right steps to comply with it, but then also looking at security separately, because organizations get themselves into trouble when they treat security as a checklist kind of event. If you say, okay, I'm compliant with these, with what it requires to be PCI compliant, you still see these organizations getting breached, from it. So you want to look at, okay, what are the additional security requirements? Do you need to be in that business? Maybe are you tokenizing the data, from that aspect of it? So there's lots of ways to deal with it where maybe you're not holding the PCI regulated data. Maybe you're tokenizing it and only exchanging the tokens. So part of it is looking at almost getting back to the core competencies from the payment point of view. Is maybe that's something you're outsourcing from that aspect of it, of handling that data, where you're just tokenizing the data and you're providing a better interface for your customers, and better payment, better wallet. So part of it is looking at where are you taking the risk as an organization, and also looking at from the point of view of having it from a security and a compliance look, making sure you're looking at it separately through those two lenses, to make sure that there's no gaps that are being missed from that point of view, because you can be compliant and still have an incident.
Awesome. So we had someone say, could you say something about current trends and regulations regarding using personal demographic and behavioral data for predicting model for risk management in financial and other industries?
So I think part of it looks at, again, depends upon which regulatory regime you fall under. So part of it is looking at, how are you collecting that data? Number one, of the point of view is, did you have a right to that data? Because it's one of those things of, and does the individual understand how that data is being used? Because when you look at things like CCPA, you want to make sure that you're adhering towards the requirements for, in that case, California residents. But so really looking at it, it's a complex answer. So part of it is looking at how did you come by that data, from that point of view. So it's known collecting versus are you just randomly scraping things from the web, in which case there could be huge degrees of variability in that data. So part of it is looking at, did you have a right to it? What's the integrity of that data from that aspect of it? And how is it being used from the point of view? Because if you're going to all of a sudden put that into an AI or ML for like credit decisions, how do you make sure that you're not creating model bias? We've already seen things in the news where, people in the same household were getting approved for different levels of credit, from that point of view. And it's questionable whether, they were using the full credit scores of each individual or whether it was some other data that was being gathered. So, and it's a tricky area, especially when you look at even things like healthcare, where you look at potentially the greater good that could be done by analyzing more data. You still have to weigh that against the risks of the, what's your right to the data? Do you have permission to use it in that manner? Is your ability to de-identify that data and still get the results that you want without causing potential harm to anyone?
Okay, David, final
You're asking complicated questions.
That was a good one. So lastly, are there any options against current ransom attacks since they have increased lately?
Yeah, so I mean, ransomware is one of those things that, it's so prevalent because it works so well. So the key thing there is going back to kind of that defense in depth model of the how do you deal with it from an end to end. So I'd say that the first thing is, the security awareness, which is like the unsung hero of all of these things, is you need a regular cadence of how do you train your employees, to look at things like phishing. Like if you're getting an attachment, were you expecting that attachment? Can you mouse over it and see, does it point to a different website where there's a misspelling? So part of it is looking at, phishing is still probably the #1 vector for getting ransomware, from that point of view. Otherwise, it's, compromised credentials, people coming in through, your VPN after they get your credentials. So part of it is looking at how do you promote a environment of good security hygiene, and that starts with how do you educate your people not to click on bad things. And again, it's very, the phishing emails have gotten very, very good, because if you're a high profile individual, odds are I can find enough information on LinkedIn, Facebook, wherever to kind of create an email that you have a high likelihood of, of clicking on. I might see on your Facebook page that you're, coaching the soccer team. So I might be able to send an email saying, hey, soccer team update or something along those lines. From that. So you have to have a constant culture of awareness. And then really, you also have to have good endpoint management. So if you see something, somebody does click on something and it gets downloaded, how quickly can you detect it? Because ransomware is so effective because of how fast it spreads. From that point of view, do you have means of, segregating your network so it can be isolated so you don't lose the whole thing? So that's another aspect of it. And part of it kind of goes back to also the endpoint management. Do you have good control over those end users' laptops and things like that? It's a whole different can of worms too if you allow bring your own device. What can you enforce on an end user device and how can you do that? And the other aspect of it is assuming, you need to think about what's your recoverability from the perspective of a ransomware attack. So how quickly can you recover it? Do you have good integrated backups from that point of view? So you may need to change your resiliency and recovery strategy. Because again, if your backups are highly connected, how do you have a way of segmenting it to make sure that if you do get ransomed and your primary production gets encrypted, how do you not, make sure that your secondary or your backup hasn't gotten corrupted from that point of view? And that might be, nearline, offline. There's lots of ways to do that from that aspect of it. And also thinking about the point of view of, nobody really ever recommends paying the ransom. Organizations wind up having to do it because they usually look at, maybe they didn't think through that full backup concept, or maybe all of a sudden, if it was a hospital or a healthcare institution, they'll be back, they can't afford to be down for 3 weeks, from that aspect of it. So maybe they had to pay. And then you have to be very careful because now when you look at, guidance issued by the Treasury, there's civil and potentially criminal penalties that if you pay ransomware and it was to a nation state or an actor that supports terrorism, now you could get yourself jammed up twice. So you could be breaking the law while you're trying to help your company recover. So that needs to be really thought through. So I think, organizations need to really examine what does it mean to be resilient in today's terms, because, ransomware is going to be here to stay for a while. Why some of that money may be recovered, it's all a matter of time. How quickly can they move it to different wallets to cash out? So there can't be an expectation that you're going to necessarily recover your money, or you can't even necessarily have an expectation that you're going to fully recover. Because in some cases, when you look at what's it like NotPetya, the decryption keys didn't work, from that aspect of it. So I'd say, you need a holistic approach to be able to deal with ransomware.
Well, thank you, David. You did absolutely great. And thank you to everyone who submitted a question today. I'm so sorry we couldn't get to all of them, but I'm going to pass it back over to Bruce.
Well, thank you very much, Crystal, and thank you, David, and for wonderful sessions. And digital banking is absolutely important as we go from the brick and mortar business into digital transformation of businesses. And so thanks again for the wonderful sessions. And everyone, just want to remind you that we have 2 more sessions for today. The next session will be at 1 p.m. Eastern Time. We're going to have the Senior Vice President of Gum, which is a company focused on using data science and artificial intelligence and to enhance and to do marketing, to do advertising and branding and so forth. And it's an extremely fascinating field. And so it will be a high-level tutorial type of sessions that will be at 1 p.m. Eastern Time today. And then at 3 p.m., and we will finish up the day with threat detection intelligence from another Chief Information Security Officer in the New England area and who is in the healthcare industry. All right, everyone, thank you for attending, and we will see you at 1 p.m.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.